Hi, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean McIntosh, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about SAM tools, and SAM tools are very helpful in helping track assets entitlements, but are only part of a total software asset management solution. Today, Mike Austin is going to dig into the reality of the solution, despite what some of the vendors tell you. Lines are muted during the webcast, and questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. If you have any questions, please submit them via the chat console, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for encore viewing at method180.com. We will also send you an email in the days ahead with links to the recording and the slides. As usual, our speaker today is Mike Austin. Mike leads the service delivery team here at Method 180 and has successfully negotiated over $1 billion in Microsoft contracts over his career. He spent almost a decade working at Microsoft in licensing related roles and has an extensive experience in reducing software licensing costs. Mike, I'll turn things over to you to get started.
Great, thanks, Sean. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about what your SAM vendor isn't telling you, or what they're not telling us in general. And I know there's a lot out there around ISAM and software asset management and things like that. And I'm really not going to touch on those sort of concepts today. I really want to focus on this from a software licensing, software contracting perspective, and the challenges that organizations have. Where they're trying to address those with tools and processes, and sort of where those tools and processes maybe fall a little short. So for those of you that are new, I know I see a bunch of people that regularly attend our webinars on today, but for those of you that are new and may not know about Method 180, I'll just take a couple of quick seconds and talk about ourselves. So we're a small consulting firm that focuses primarily around two things. One is helping organizations drive cost out of their contracts with software vendors such as Microsoft, whether that's kind of a renewal or net new agreement, or looking to add licenses to your agreement. The second thing that we do is kind of twofold, but it's really the same sort of thing. We have a Microsoft Audit Assistance, or I guess more than just Microsoft now, but Vendor Audit Assistance program, where if you are getting audited by a vendor, we'll come in and help you defend through that audit, focusing on making that process smoother, less time consuming for you, and obviously, driving a cost out of what the findings were. We also do a self-assessment as well, where if you want to take a look at where you're at and get an understanding of what licenses you have versus your deployments, we follow a very similar process that the auditors themselves would do, and we can do a self-assessment for you. But today, really what I want to talk about, and I know this is a little bit of an eye chart, but really what I want to talk about is what I call, SAM for software contracts, or at least at a basic level. And so I'm going to go through kind of each of these pillars, and I apologize, my graphic design skills aren't the greatest, but I think this at least gets across what we want to talk about today. So, at the top level, and I'm going to go through each one of these, but at the top level, you have your customer risk. What is it that you face every day? Changes in licensing, increase in pricings, audit. How do you manage all that? And then below that, you have your contract and your licensing data. So in other words, we signed up, and I'll use Microsoft as an example, as a Microsoft Enterprise Agreement, but the EA itself is not the only governing contract, or governing contract, I guess is the best way to put it. There's other things that govern how we can use those licenses, and what we can and can't do with them, and how we count, and different metrics. Then we have software deployment tools such as System Center or Microsoft Map, or maybe even a tool like Flexera or Snow from an asset management perspective. And sometimes those tools are a sole source. Sometimes those tools are an aggregator. So, for instance, you may have a Flexera implementation where SCCM and other tools are feeding into Flexera, as well as using Flexera to do inventory. So then that's, what I call data collection. And then below that, you get into what I call software inventory and normalization. And there's some tools that do this. Some of those ones up in the top do this, but this is really where we take that raw data and we take it and we make it, we normalize it out so that it's only data that is required to look at from a licensing perspective. I always tell people that if you're even a small shop with like 1,000 users, that if we pull inventory data just for Microsoft, we're going to be tens of thousands, if not up into 100,000 of rows of data than would just come back from a raw perspective. So these tools clean up the noise, get rid of hot fixes and patches and things that aren't licensable, and normalize out the tool. And then from there, once you have that, you take and you create these what I'll call customer deliverables. Some of those are automated in tools. Some of it is a manual process. There's combinations of both where you can run reports in the tools, then manipulate those reports and put them back in the tools and get these positions. But there's customer deliverables. In other words, you create an estimated license position. You create a cost analysis. And each of these tools can do certain elements of this. So some of them just do the deployment, some of them do a deployment and software inventory. Some of them kind of go down through this gray bar halfway and stop. If you look at it from a percentage of completeness of inventory normalization. So it's all kinds of different stuff depending on what tool you have in place. But up to this point, this customer deliverable point, we call that standard deliverables here at Method 180. And what I mean by that is you're just taking the inventory, applying licensing at a very rudimentary level without what I'll call intelligence, okay? And so what do I mean by intelligence? And that's where you start to go deeper into this vendor licensing area that I have down here in this kind of orangey color with proprietary processes, okay? And so what do I mean by that? I mean, how do you take the deployment data and look at contract data and elements of contract and how those apply to how we count versus just looking at sort of like a grocery list of I have this installed, I have this installed, I have this installed, I have these licenses, I assign it to them. So it's about applying specific knowledge for a very specific vendor. We believe that in order to do real advanced stuff with contracts, you have to have an expert on the vendor. It's very difficult to be an expert on Microsoft and Oracle and IBM and SAP. It's hard enough just for me to be an expert just on Microsoft, let alone learn another vendor. So you need somebody that has very specific knowledge of that vendor, how their contracting works, how their sales processes work, all of that. And once you take and apply some of that intelligence, you get into an optimized customer deliverable and output. So when we do audit work, for instance, I would say that the auditors only go to standard deliverables. So, that's the reason why when we get into work with a client that's getting audited, we're able to take and drive out another 30, 40, 50, 60% sometimes because we apply this level of intelligence onto, the standard deliverables to create an optimized position. And we're going to go into each of these in a second, but you can then take that optimized position and create optimized deliverables, specific scenarios to you as a customer, specific cost modeling to you as a customer based on your product roadmap and your forecast and where you're going versus, just purchasing on a program or buying to settle out an audit. So I'm going to talk about each of these here. So I'm going to start with that top section, this one here, the customer risks. What is it that customers face? You're constantly faced with vendor licensing changes, okay? There was a study done out of licensing school, which is an organization over in the UK, and I believe that they said that in the 3-year term of a Microsoft enterprise agreement, that there are about 1,500 licensing changes that Microsoft will apply. Let's let that sit in for a second. In a 3-year term, 1,500 licensing changes that will happen, whether that's a change in the contract, whether it's a new product, whether it's a change in the product terms, 1,500 licensing changes in a 3-year term. And so how do you manage that? How do you manage the different license types that results in? So in other words, take just Windows Server, was processor-based, now core-based when they launched 2016. How do I manage those different license types? How do I manage that within my tool? If I don't have a tool, how do I do it manually? How does the change affect my contract? Right? So how does it affect me personally? So if Microsoft makes a change to the cores on 2016, when am I impacted? Is it right away? Is it when I deploy? Is it when my contract expires? Is it after my contract expires? All of that takes some level of intelligence, and this is what I'm talking about. This is where the intelligence comes in, is if you look and just apply standard rules around that, you're probably just going to apply current rules. And so that may not be the case because these rules may affect you at some different point in the future, okay? So the real question is, when do they affect me? Or when can I use them to my advantage, not to affect me, okay? A great example of that is Microsoft has language where that if I was on an Office Pro SA and then I convert it to an Office 365, They have this transition rule that allows you to convert from Pro to an Office 365 license and kind of drop my SA and move into a subscription. Well, they also have language buried in their contract that allows you to go from an Office 365 subscription back to an on-premise SA. It's buried in your contract, right? And those rules may be advantageous to you within an audit. They may be advantageous to you within at the time of renewal of your contract. But how does that apply? How do I look at inventory data and make that licensing logic make sense? Okay. What else do customers face? You face price increases. Again, I'm going to pick on Microsoft's Windows Core license model that they brought out. It was a price increase in disguise. Microsoft, said we'll give you an 8-core to 1 processor ratio. They knew that there was a number of servers out there that had greater than 8 cores. And so applying that 8-core ratio, or 16 per server, because they assume everything's two processors nowadays, they knew that there's a bunch of 24s and 40-core servers out there. So that's really just a cost increase. How do you manage that? Not just from a deployment data, but if I'm reporting on processors today and I want to get ahead of it, how do I manage that? What's the needed functionality, that you need to manage licenses outside of your current contract, right? So what I mean by that is Microsoft brings in new functionality into a product. EMS is a great example, their Enterprise Mobility Suite. They brought that out. It's a tool really to manage Office 365, and you need it in order to do some of the advanced stuff, but it's increased functionality, and you got to make a TCO to do that and justify it. And so how do you do that? How do you look at deployment data or license data and do that? That's very difficult, right? How do you keep track of true ups, right? So what I mean by that is, how do you count, right? Again, go back to what licensing rules apply. When do they apply? When can I apply the ones that make the most sense for me versus maybe another set of rules? And then Microsoft is now starting to enforce that you have to true up to the maximum level that you deployed throughout the year. They put some language in that contract about 4 years ago that said that, and they're now going out and enforcing it. So in the past, people would look at their true ups 30, 60 days out. Now you have to keep some historic stuff, and that's difficult as well. And of course, customers are always concerned with audits and SAM engagements because they know that the vendors are doing these. Most organizations, I was at an event with about 100 and some odd customers at it, and basically a third had been audited in a year. Last year, a third were going through an audit, and the other third hadn't. I sort of looked at them and said, well, it's your turn, it's coming. If you haven't been going through a vendor audit, it's coming. So you're constantly concerned with that, and that's why you go out and implement, SAM tools to kind of help through that. So I'm going to go through this yellow box here and talk about vendor contracts and licensing data here for a couple of seconds. Okay, so what do I mean by vendor contracts and licensing details, right? So you have software license entitlements, right? So how do you track those, right? Is that just the licenses that are within my enterprise agreement? Are those the only licenses I should use? Do I have other entitlements outside of that agreement? How do I track those? Microsoft has a process, and again, because I'm the Microsoft expert here, I'm going to talk about them. They have a process where you can go into the MVLS site or the Microsoft Volume Licensing site and download a license report that'll tell you what licenses they have on record for you. There's some weaknesses in that, that it's only what contracts you have associated with you as a user that it's going to pull against. So if there's other organizations that you bought, if you haven't parented those up to you, if you hadn't brought in some of your historic ones, you're going to be missing entitlements. Or do you go and request a Microsoft license statement where Microsoft goes out and researches you and all the organizations you bought and all the license entitlements you have? So that's one way. There's also stuff within the software contracts. So you have terms and conditions, within the contract itself that you need to track changes. So a good example of that is, Microsoft has licensing for qualified users. The definition of qualified user has changed over the years. Which one applies to you and when? Right? What's in your contract? So when you're at an event and you hear somebody speaking and they're talking about what a qualified employee is, does that actually apply to you, or do you have language that's different than what that person's speaking of? Because it's probably speaking to what the current language is, right? So a great example is current language says you and your contractors. I had a whole session on this, but older language said you and your on-site contractors, so you could exclude off-site. So that stuff is stuff that you need to track, how it applies to you, when it applies to you, You have to be careful what you're hearing out there from a licensing perspective, because if your contract says one thing and somebody else is referring to something based on different language, you can apply those rules differently and you may not have to. Okay? So how do you manage that? Right? You obviously have pricing and a CPS from Microsoft. It's a price sheet that gives you future pricing. Where does that get tracked? How do you keep track of that? There's also the Microsoft product terms. So that's just a document that lives online that Microsoft updates. I believe it's at least every quarter. It might be every 30 days, where they change, what you can and can't do and how definitions work and things like that. So, when does the product terms override the EA agreement or vice versa? All of that takes some level of intelligence to understand. And then obviously there's the online service terms for use of Office 365 or things like Azure. Then there's also a whole other bucket of licenses out there that people buy that they just don't know how to keep track of or don't keep track of. So there's licenses purchased through other vendors, whether those are, some other software company that creates a solution that has SQL Server embedded in it, and they sell you that solution with SQL. I had a client recently, they're a smaller one, but they told me that they did not have any SQL Enterprise. We did a self-assessment with them. We went out and we found 2 instances of SQL Enterprise, which for an organization their size was, a substantial finding. But as we dug back, we found out that they actually got those licenses through some hardware that they purchased, and that they actually had proof that they were allowed to use it with that hardware, and so we didn't have to count them. But if we hadn't identified that and they were audited and we kind of didn't ask a few questions of them, they never would have known that. Now, once we found that out, how do you keep track of that? How do you document it, right? So licenses come from all kinds of places now. How do you keep track of that? So now I'm going to talk about the blue and software deployment and data sources, right? So there's all kinds of management tools out there. We see customers that use them all. You have SCCM, you have Maps. Some people just use scripts, or auditors like to use scripts at least. There's Altiris, there's ServiceNow. There's a bunch of management tools that will do inventory. Then there's, what I'll call more pure SAM tools, Flexera, Snow, Landsweeper. Those tools will also do inventory and some management, Landsweeper more than maybe Flexera or Snow, but they also are tools that you can go out and get inventory for. Where else do you need to get information from? In the Microsoft world, Active Directory, maybe an LDAP for a vendor like Oracle or SAP. And so how do you pull all that information together? And then, add on to the complexity of that of the cloud, right? What's deployed out there in AWS or Azure or, some other third-party data center? How do I actually track that? Am I responsible for the licenses? When can and can't I use my licenses, right? So there's a lot of concepts out there now or talk about bring your own licenses to the cloud versus purchasing those through the vendor directly. And there's scenarios where you can use your own licenses, and there's scenarios when you can't. So if I just pick on Office for a second, if I put Office up in AWS, let's say up in the workspace, if Office is on dedicated hardware, so if I have AWS workspace dedicated hardware, I can bring my own Office license. But if that's on shared hardware, Microsoft says no to that because they don't have cloud mobility for Office. So I can't take my own Office license. I have to purchase that through the vendor, which I already own an Office license, and now I'm purchasing another one, which can be quite frustrating. But managing that gets very complex. Take a SQL Server implementation. I put a SQL Server up in Azure. I have cloud mobility through SA on SQL Server. I want to take my SQL Server license in. I'm more than allowed to do that. But my Windows Server does not have that right for AWS because it doesn't have cloud mobility. So I can't take my own Windows Server. So I can take my SQL, but I got to buy Windows from Amazon. But on Azure, Microsoft will let me take my Windows Server and my SQL Server. So, it's just very complicated what's going on out there. And how do you keep track of that? How do I know where those licenses are? Who, when, what, right? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about software inventory and normalization next. So what is inventory, and what do I mean by inventory and normalization, right? So I'm going to talk more about normalization. I think inventory is pretty straightforward. Go out, sniff the network, pull back the data. The bigger challenge being, what's the completeness of that data? Can we prove that we were able to get 100% of our devices inventory, whether it's desktop servers or virtual or physical? Can we inventory 100%? But let's assume we can. So what's normalization? Normalization is removing the noise. So can my asset management tool remove the noise correctly, right? Does it cascade licenses properly, right? And so here's what I mean by that. Let's just again go back and pick on Microsoft and pick on Office, right? So if I have Office Pro 2016 installed on a machine and Office Pro 2010 installed on a machine, and then, is that all I'm going to see in the data when I run a report to give me what's kind of licensable, right? Do I just see Office 2016 and 2013, or do I see, 10 hot fixes or some patch that was put in, or some add-in tool that's not licensable? Do I see that stuff or not? I want that stuff in the data, but I don't necessarily want to see it when I'm looking at it from a licensing perspective. So can my asset management tool normalize data? Some of them do a good job. Some of them don't do a great job. Some of them do a good job on server. Some of them do a good job on desktop. So you have to watch, because otherwise you're going to be doing a bunch of manual processes here, right? What do I mean by cascade licenses? If I go back to that Office example where I have 2016 and 2013 on the same machine, if I have an Office 26 license for Pro, I'm allowed to use it to have an underlying lower license as long as it's the same edition, so Pro to Pro here. So does it count that I need two licenses? Does it count one? Has it built that intelligence, that license intelligence that actually comes out of the product terms into the tool, right? Most of them don't have that sort of intelligence built in, right? So I can give you an example, and it's even in the Microsoft in their data, in their sample data. So Microsoft, if you're familiar, they have a tool called Map that they use. They'll go out and do inventory, and they like to use this in their SAM engagements, particularly with small customers. And so the sample database that they have actually overstates the position of Office, because it's got, if you actually break into and pull the data, it's actually counting 2 installs of Office on the same machine as requiring 2 licenses, which the license rules don't say that. So if you're just running map and running the standard report, you could be overstating your positions, right? So that cascade of license is very important. The other thing that's very important for the inventory tools to do is, can it structure your data and display that data in a way that you can optimize your licensing? So one of the things that we've spent a lot of time on here over the last 2-3 years is developing our own processes for displaying data in a way that we can optimize licenses. And so that's very important, because if you look at exporting data out of these tools to apply your licenses to, it comes out as a flat file, not organized in a manner where I can look at host to guest to CPU to core to virtual CPU to virtual core, and to cluster. All of those relationships are very important, and a lot of the time this data comes out of these tools and it's not structured that way. So if you were looking to optimize, how do you do that when your data is not even structured in a manner that's optimized? So does your SAM tool structure data in a way that's there for optimization? And how does it create relationships between the various data sources? And so here's what I mean by that. When you're looking at an audit and Active Directory is being used, for instance, to determine if a device is a qualified device and should be licensed or not, if I exclude a device at the AD level because it doesn't need to be included, let's say it's a line of business machine that I don't have to license in my EA, but it has Office on it, and I can still get away with that in some scenarios, is it going to count that Office install as needing a license later? Or is it able to say, I excluded that at the AD level, so don't show me that in any of the license reports? What are those relationships? Have they done the hooks? My experience tells me that a lot of the asset management tools out there lack in this area, right? And I talk a lot about what's best of breed versus multi-purpose, right? So what we see is a lot of organizations want to use an asset management tool to do everything. And the challenge, in my opinion, with doing that is they're not all built the same way, or for this, and they can't be. And here's what I mean by that. If you build your tool based on Microsoft and Microsoft licensing rules, and I build my tool based on Oracle and Oracle licensing rules, I'm going to have a real hard time taking the logic and the coding that I've done to Oracle and applying that to Microsoft, because their licensing models are very different. There is some similarity, but there's a lot of differences. So depending on how you built up your code base is going to determine how successful you are going across various vendors based on the different ways that they build their license schemas. Okay, let that sit in for a couple of seconds, because a lot of times your SAM tools are telling you, oh, we can do everything. We can do IBM and SAP and Oracle and Microsoft. But if you think about the fundamentals of how licensing is done by all those organizations, it's done differently. How does a SAM tool manage that? Especially when you put in data into a table in a database, and how does it manage that? And so you really want to take a look at, do I want a tool that does everything? And maybe there's good reason for that. I'm not knocking those deployments, but I'm just saying that they're going to lack that intelligence level, in my opinion, because they can't do this across all the vendors like they want to. Or do I just go out and get a best of breed tool that works on, one vendor only, or vendors that are similar? Like, I think you could do Adobe with a Microsoft tool, right? Because they're kind of built in a similar fashion, right? The other thing as well is at just point in time versus the ongoing upkeep. So in other words, a lot of these tools, for instance, are point in time. So if I sign a license, it's based on how I sign that a license today. If the VM moves, for instance, I sign data center and the VM moves off of that host that was unlimited virtualization to another host, it doesn't know to look at that and reassign licenses. It's point in time license assignment versus intelligence built into there. In fact, some of these tools, I know that if you assign a data center license to the host, it doesn't even know not to license the individual VMs. Right? So you have to kind of trick the tool, right? Okay, so I'm going to talk about customer deliverables, right? So what do you get when you do this? Oops, I go the wrong way. Yeah. So after I've deployed a tool, I've figured out my licenses. Usually, what happens is I create kind of like I go in and I do my license assignment. So some of these tools will apply licenses with some logic, or a lot of them are manual assignment of licenses. A lot of organizations, even though they might apply it with some logic, are pulling the data out, manipulating it, assigning licenses on their own, and then importing back into the tools to get a little bit of optimization on the licenses. But license assignment with these tools a lot of the time is very manual, right? The logic hasn't been built. And it's very difficult, I would think, to build it. But anyways, the logic hasn't really been built, so it's a manual license assignment. You assign the licenses, and then what you do next is you create an estimated license position, right? And so basically, what's an estimated license position? I take my deployments versus my entitlements. They're in the tool, and it creates a view of where I'm over and where I am under, right? So it's basically a ledger of compliance or non-compliance, really. Some of the tools will create those automatically for you. Others, it's manual, right? So again, if they're telling you that the tool is out of the box, it does it. One of the things that I would be asking is, can it manually create ELPs? Can it do it for all my vendors, right? Then what a lot of customers will do is they'll take that information and they're going to do a cost analysis based on that license information that they have on their deployments and on their accounts. And they'll do their licensing renewals with those programmatic rules that they've got in there, and the entitlements and deployments, which I think if you're following along, you'll see this isn't necessarily optimized, right? It's kind of what's there, what we're doing manually, what we know, but how do we apply all that logic around the rules within the licenses themselves, or the contracts themselves, or product use rights? And so I put in here that we consider this to basically be basic SAM for contract management, right? It just kind of it's there, it's good, it's a lot better than a lot of organizations have, and there is a lot of low-hanging fruit that can be identified here. But I also hear a lot of customers say, we put in our SAM tool, we found 20% savings by cleaning up some project in Visio and doing some things, and found some hosts that weren't so optimized. So we moved the VMs or the SQL databases to another host, and we were able to clean some things up. But it's still very, very basic, right? And so it's where you really go deep is where I'm about to go, and this is around vendor licensing and having a SME, somebody that really understands their licensing policies and their rules. And how do you take those standard deliverables and dive deeper into them to make some proprietary processes and to make some decisions with that intelligence that I've been talking about built into it? Okay, so what do I mean with that? By that, there's a lot of large organizations we work with, and I'm always amazed when we get hired by, call it a Fortune 10 or a Fortune 20 that has a lot of people that do these things, and why do they still hire, Method 180 to work with them? The reason is they're looking for vendor specific expertise, right? So, they hire us because of our Microsoft knowledge, and they go after us to, supplement their team around very specific expertise. And I think when you're doing this, you want to look at somebody that not only has licensing expertise, but also has auditing expertise with your vendor. So if you're going out to look for SME, I would say go look for somebody that does both. Because when you're optimizing a contract renewal, one of the things that you may have to do is optimize your license position first, and you want to do that within compliance. So you want somebody that can optimize your licenses, ensure you're compliant, and then move forward, right? You want them to have the ability to apply intelligence to standard SAM deliverables. So this is the stuff like, how does my contract work? What is unique within my contract? So many times when we do audit work, we'll go back and read a customer's contract and tell them this is exactly what it says in your contract. And then we'll go and look at the auditor's findings and saying they're applying B, they should be applying A. And because they're applying B, they say you're short, but when you look at it from A, what you have, you're not non-compliant, right? And so how do you build that into a tool? And I'm just trying to think of what would be a good example of one that we really recently had. Oh, here's a great example. We had a client that had a customized contract, so they had some special language in there. And it had some special language that said what they could do around the exit of their agreement. And they had a subscription agreement, and they were allowed to do to buy some certain licenses out at a special price up to a certain quantity. And so what they did was they wanted to actually move from subscription back to perpetual licenses. And so they were able to take advantage of this special buyout and then roll into software assurance, where the vendor was like, no, you have subscription, you have to go to license and SA only. And it took us a number of calls with them to say, hey, no, that's not how it works. Here's the language within our contract. This is what our contract says we can do, and we can do this. And we prepped them up. The lawyers got on a call. They phoned me afterwards and said, well, that was fun. As soon as we kind of walked through our logic, you could hear the pin drop, and the account team go, oh, we didn't know, right? So even their account team didn't know, right? So you really want to look at what's unique within your contract. If you negotiated something special, what version of the contract you're on, what version of the product terms can and can't you use, all of that sort of stuff. And that all goes down to what rules apply to you. And then how do you analyze that the deployment data to really dig into applying intelligence on here? A great example is most organizations nowadays, at least once you start to get into a certain size, have one or two or more profiles on their enterprise agreement. So what I mean is it's not all Office 365 E3, Windows OS, and CoreCal. They might have some E1, some E3. They have 2 or 3 different licenses that they're doing on the enterprise products. And so how do you actually take that stuff and look at the data and make that real? Whether that's within AD user data to assign Office 365 licenses, whether it's in desktop deployment data to exclude line of business machines if I'm a manufacturer. How do I exclude my shop floor machines from needing to be in my account? How do I track that stuff? Is it manual? Is it go in and do it once? Is there something I can do within Active Directory? Does my asset management tool allow me to pull those rules if I look at it and do it within Active Directory across to the tool itself? Okay. And so when you start to get to those places, what you end up doing is you create proprietary processes that become rules-based. And by rules-based, I mean, what can I do and can I do within my contract? It implies intelligence on the contract. What amendments do I have? What version of my contracts? What's the past history? Can I pull in entitlements? Do I have some rights from an ISV? Do I have some rights from using it within the cloud or from the cloud provider that are better, right? And then that gives you very specific knowledge on how to negotiate based on your true needs. Because I've drilled in below that standard level. Now I'm getting into the specifics, okay? So I'm going to talk now about optimized customer deliverables and outputs. Okay, so what do I mean by that? It's customer-specific scenarios, right? So it's not just the raw data dump that shows we have 5,000 PCs. It is we have 4,092 knowledge worker PCs, and we have 908 line of business machines, and here they are. And these are the licensing rules that apply to knowledge-based machines, and these are the licensing rules that apply to our line of business machines. It is not assumptions. It is not generic rules. It is very specific. Here's our data. Here's how it's manipulated. Here's how it's looked at. This is what we do with it. Once you have that, then you can start to build licensing models based on your own needs, right? So if I'm in an enterprise agreement and I've done all this, I've done the SAM work, I've got my data, I've got my entitlements, I go and apply the logic and the intelligence layer below that. Now I can actually start to really look at specifics on what makes sense for me. And you can do that based on what you can do, not based on a program that the vendor's trying to push on you, right? Again, I always go back to, is an enterprise agreement the right licensing vehicle? Maybe, but maybe not. Is Microsoft going to sell you an enterprise agreement? All they want to talk to you about is an enterprise agreement? All they want to talk to you about is Office 365? Absolutely. But that may not be what's best for you. There may be hybrids. There may be things that you can do differently. You may be able to take this intelligence that you've gained by going through this sort of process and develop your own licensing scenarios and push your vendors, Microsoft and others, to change what they do for you because you've got data to support that their model breaks for you, right? You can also then start to take and build into that your own product roadmaps and forecasts, right? So in other words, I can take a look at that and say, if I'm going to do a settlement on an audit and I'm going to be forced to buy some licenses, the vendors nowadays are saying, if you take Office 365 or cloud in Oracle or, wherever, that will give you a better settlement. Well, you can actually make those purchase decisions smarter, right? We know what our roadmap is. We know what our forecast is. We know how our data resides. Now I can go and say, I can either consume this or I can't. So is it a good deal? No, but maybe I could take some of this product over here because it's on my roadmap out there. I know how I can get to it and I can bring that in. So it gives you just a deeper level of understanding and moves you to a different place when you're doing audit settlements. Because if you've listened to any of my audit webinars in the past, at some point an audit turns from a fact-based discovery to a negotiation, and I can use this if I've done this to settle that. When it comes to my renewals, I can build licensing models based around me, around what I need, right? I always say all the time that contract renewals and deployments rarely, if ever, align. And so what do I mean by that? If I've gone and done this, I actually just want to call before the webinar with one of my clients. And they're in this scenario where 3 years ago they switched over to Office 365. They never deployed it. They're still probably 9 to 12 months from deploying it. And Microsoft's like, you need to renew it. And the reality is, and I've showed them, renew what you absolutely need to. Your Windows OS, your Windows servers, your SQL servers, renew what you absolutely need to. And Microsoft's proposal is X. And so if we pull that out, and then Microsoft says, well, you're going to lose your discount, and you're going to lose the 10% SA from SA on Office 365, so it's going to cost you more money. And they are right. It was about a 10% price increase for them to put Office 365 in later. The difference is they didn't pay for 9 months of software assurance, or they're not going to pay for 9 months of Office 365 subscriptions. And so Microsoft's proposal actually is more expensive than if they just do the bare minimum, put Office 365 in 9 months from now, and pay the net, reset their price per unit to the more expensive one. Because they're saving 3/4 of the first year payment, right? It's 25% of those license costs over the term of the contract versus a measly 10% savings to do it off the SA SKUs. So, the unfortunate thing is your deployments rarely align to when the renewals are, and Microsoft and all these vendors try and cram you into the renewals based on what they see in the deployment, or sorry, not what they see in the deployment, but what they want to do, right? And if you really are smart about it, you can get to the point where you can tell them that this just doesn't make sense. And so I think that's really what I wanted to get across today, is just that, if I go back to this here real quickly, it's that, most organizations, when they go out and they implement a tool, Flexera, Snow, it doesn't matter, an asset management tool, they think that they've got the answer. Okay, and the thing is, and I'm not knocking them. These are great. They're great tools. Customers get a lot of value out of them, but I think they scratch the surface. Right? I think you only get to a certain level. You can get some optimization in there. How much of that's manual versus automatic in the tool, probably, is to be determined. I think it's going to be customer specific, but I think a lot more of it is probably manual than a lot of people expect when they get into these projects. But the real savings, where you really drive cost out, where you really get the leg up in negotiations with your vendors, is when you start to apply a level of intelligence below that data collection, data normalization, and standard license creation. Okay. Sean, I don't know if I haven't been paying attention if there's any questions or not, but if there are, if you want to go ahead and pop those up, and I'm just going to pop up a quick poll for what people would like on our next webinar while Sean does that.
Yeah, absolutely. While Mike's putting the poll up, I guess what I was just going to say is now is the question and answer period. So if anyone has any questions, please use the console and we'll get those answered. But I have got one for you, Mike. So if you're looking for a tool, what are the things you would look for in a tool if you were kind of looking at the tool vendor landscape today? Are there specific functionalities that you think are really important and critical?
So I think to answer that question, it would be much more around what is it that you're trying to accomplish and where is your biggest spend, right? Because I think you're going to find that that's going to be dependent on what you're trying to go after, right? So if you're trying to go after, say, Microsoft, then that would be one thing. If you're trying to go after Oracle, then you may have a bunch of different kind of requirements. But I think two things. One is I'm not a fan of the tools out there that think that they should be the collection engine of the data, right? So I think that anything that you bring in from a SAM perspective needs to be able to consume data from multiple sources. Their own engine can be a part of that source, but I think that they need to be able to consume data from multiple sources, because if you look at it, it's just too broad, right? Like you can't manage, I don't know, say Cisco networking with the same tool that's doing Microsoft, that's doing Oracle, that's doing IBM, and people want to do that. And maybe some of the logic can be built in the tool, but the collection engine itself is different. And so I think being able to accept data from somewhere else is probably one of the key things that I would say. And then from there, it's about what is it that I get out. Don't fall in love with the pretty graphs and charts that they make. Those things are important, but a lot of the times we'll see people that will just absolutely love a graph because they can show me every single place in the world where I have a server. Well, what's the reality of that, right? So make sure that you can get user-friendly information based on what you need. So if I was to do an evaluation, I would start with what it is that I want to see, and then build backwards from there from what the requirements are, and then go to the tool vendors to see who's got the best fit based on what those requirements are.
Okay, thank you. So Mike, here's another question. Can a tool alone, a lot of them say they can help in audit scenarios, can a tool alone by itself constitute a viable audit defense?
I don't believe so. So first off, sometimes the vendors themselves won't even accept the tool's information in an audit. Even if they're a partner and certified partner of the vendor, they won't accept it as a sole source, at least. They'll accept data from a source, but they're going to want to validate it. So I don't know of any tool that I've seen, and I've run into most of them now in our audit work. I don't know of any tool where we haven't pulled the data out and then manipulated it and gotten better results for the client. So that's that intelligence layer that I was talking about, is just in action, is that if they can only get so far based on how they're built and designed, and then you need that intelligence layer underneath it to go further.
Okay, I've got a question here, and this one may be a little tricky, but can you estimate the amount of time that should be dedicated monthly to keeping your Microsoft licensing information up to date?
So I think that's going to depend on how big you are, right? I've got a client that's 100,000 users who have 3 full-time people, not necessarily dedicated to Microsoft, but dedicated to SAM in general. So it's really going to depend on how big you are. The reality is with Microsoft, and I'm happy to have a conversation with whoever asked this question, but the reality is with Microsoft, you can get it to a point where it's, for the most part, automated, almost completely 100%. Sorry, I got a little bit of tickle, so I just put myself on mute there. But you can get Microsoft to the point where it's almost 100% automated, depending on your data sources. And so, from a monthly perspective, just kind of keeping track of what our deployments are and trying to understand if we got any true ups, or, it gets a little bit trickier with Office 365 and the reservations and clean up there. But, you could probably do it with as little as a couple of hours a month. But that's going to depend on size. I think I'd probably caveat that with saying, hey, if you're less than probably about 10,000 users or so, that's probably the case. And there may be periods of time, when you're going into the true up and really want to clean up and stuff like that, where you got to spend more. But you should be able to do it with as little as a couple hours a month if you've got the right tools to automate as much of that as possible. The first, when you get first going, it's going to take a little bit longer to apply, the contract knowledge and stuff like that, and figure out how to manage that. But once you get that set up, it should be pretty straightforward.
Thank you, Mike. I guess this is coming from myself, and this is probably more of an observation than a question, but it seems from kind of watching your presentation today and absorbing it, that these tools are really good from a conservative auditor's perspective, in terms of they're pulling the sorts of information that a very conservative auditor would want to create if they want to get a quick and dirty ELP together, but they're not necessarily pulling what from a client's perspective in terms of that optimization. Does that kind of summarize what you've been saying today?
I think that's probably one way to put it. It's definitely a good way to put it. Conservative, they probably do a little bit better job than an auditor does in their first findings in an audit, but a lot of that depends on the amount of work that you put into it, right? So I had a conversation with a client within the last week or so that actually, has a very mature implementation of one of these tools. So I won't name which one it is. But in order to, optimize their licenses, they're exporting a bunch of flat files, creating Excel pivots, doing license assignments, and then putting those back up in the tool to then run reports out of the tool to give them a compliance position. That seems wrong to me, right? But that's how they have to do it. And I'm not an expert on the tool itself to know if there's another way they could be doing it. But I do have a nagging suspicion from my conversation that that's more the rule than the exception. So.
Okay. Well, Mike, I think unless we have any last minute questions, that pretty much wraps up the questions that we have from today. So last minute, if anyone has any, now is the time to get them in. Mike, did you have any closing thoughts before we wrap up today?
No, I think that's great. Thanks everybody for coming out, and have a great afternoon.
Yeah, and I'd just like to remind everyone that we will be sending out the recording of the webinar and the slide deck in the days ahead. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll be in touch regarding the next webinar shortly. Thank you for all your input and for joining us over and over again. We really appreciate it.